Good afternoon, class. How's it going? Mr. K here, just chilling on a Saturday, doing your screencast for you. Anyway, we're going to be looking at Workshop 4 today. If you missed class on Friday and a little bit of Thursday where we started this, you missed a really awesome workshop. But don't worry, I'll catch you all up right here to make sure you guys have the same answers and that you're on the same page as the rest of the class. So don't worry about that. So let's get right into the document, shall we? So the first document, and once again, the essential question is that in 1786, the United States was this close from going into civil war. But our founding fathers prevented it, miraculously. How they did it, you're about to find out. So number one, so the first document, basically was about the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation were the first constitution, the first setup of our government as the independent United States of America. And it utterly failed in so many ways, more than I can really count and tell you here. Articles of Confederation basically set up a weak central government. It was along the premise that any type of strong central government is just a snap of the fingers away from becoming a monarchy and a tyrant like the King of England had. And that's nothing that the Americans want anything to do with. So they said, all right, let's take the opposite. Let's make the state, the local governments, really, really, really powerful. Let's give the power to the local people, the local governments and organizations. And let's keep that federal government as small as possible. Sounds like a good idea, especially if you're a bunch of Americans that got a little ornery with the over-controlling King of England. However, two big things were realized when the Articles of Confederation were put into action. Number one, government was not able to collect taxes. So the country became very, very poor. They didn't give the power, any power really, to the federal government to make revenue, to make money, to regulate trade. That was all in the hands of the states. So the federal government wasn't able to pay for things like roads and canals and things of that nature. Number two, they weren't allowed to maintain a military. So every state had its own militia, its own army. And if one of them got invaded, then there was a good chance the other states would come out and help them out, but that was really the only case. There was no unified American military, no U.S. Navy, no U.S. Army, and that's a problem, especially if you're trying to be an independent nation that's at least somewhat unified, right? And these weaknesses, they were emphasized and talked about in the document in the Shays Rebellion, rather. That's a little bit of a typo. Whiskey Rebellion is going to come later. Shays Rebellion, basically, this guy, Daniel Shays, got a bunch of farmers together, and they were fed up with the poor country, the poor roads, the poor canals, the poor support they were getting from the federal government, and they decided to take action. So they got a bunch of people together, and they went and they stormed into a town hall. They got a bunch of weapons, and basically caused a ruckus. Almost started this entire civil war throughout the countryside of the American colonies. It was this close. Luckily, some state militias were able to come together and put down this rebellion, this armed rebellion. But if it went on for any longer, there's a good chance that it would have spread to not only just the state of Massachusetts where it started, but other states in the country as well. Second document. So we talked about in the first the failures of the Articles of Confederation, just how it set up this chaotic, disordered government that just didn't work for the United States. And because of that, it caused the Founding Fathers to rethink. And they took a step back and they said, we really need to think of something else. This can't go on. So they met at the Constitutional Convention. They agreed that we need to fix the Constitution. We need to fix the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And if we can't do that, we need to start from scratch and come up with a new plan. And a new plan they came up with. But it didn't happen just like that. It took a lot of debating, a lot of compromise, a lot of arguing back and forth. And they basically, after a few months, they came up with two plans of what the new Constitution would look like and how it would function. The New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan. New Jersey Plan, similar to the Articles of Confederation, it valued the smaller states. The smaller states supported it because there was one house of Congress, one house that was making the laws, one house in the legislature, and it had equal representation among the states, no matter their size or their population, which the smaller states liked because Delaware could, chill with the big boys like New York or Georgia or North Carolina. Virginia Plan, on the other hand, favored by the large states. That had two houses of representation in Congress and two houses that were making laws. One that was all equal, and then another that was dictated by the size of the population of the state. So the more people you had living in your state, like New York, the more representation you had in making those decisions, which kind of makes sense. If you have millions of people living in one state and 5 living in another, why do you need equal representation? Those millions of people need more representation when it comes to making decisions that affect everyone, because they make up a large percent of the population. However, the two sides were combating just like that. Just when you come exactly like the British and American civic ideals, the two ideas contradicted each other. So they spent a lot of time debating in Congress, what plan are we going to go with? How are we going to solve this problem? We have two camps, and it was a pretty equally divided constitutional convention at that. They ended up with a great compromise. Basically, enough fighting, enough bickering took place that enough founding fathers said, all right, enough, we're done. Let's compromise, resolve the debate, and try to meet both sides a little bit of what they want. So the compromise created two houses in Congress, one with equal representatives and one that was determined by state population. We basically sided with the Virginia plan, but we gave a few extra kind of bones to the smaller states and ensured them that their rights would be kind of taken care of and that they would have equal representation in government. But that's the plan we went with. We used the Great Compromise to come to a compromise. Say let's have two houses, one with equal representation and one determined by state population. As we get to the fifth document, a new debate formed over the Constitution. So they decide on the whole congressional thing. How are we going to make laws? How are we going to choose representation in our government? How are we going to decide that? Problem solved. New problem. So in that House of Congress where the population determines the representation, what about slaves? Do they count? Do they not count? The southern states, they're like, yeah, of course they count. They're living human beings, right? Even though we've subjected them to slavery, and that's kind of ironic and contradictory, but that doesn't matter. We should include them in our state populations. The North was like, absolutely not. You guys have already said that they're slaves, and we don't want to give you any more power than we have to, because the North and the South, remember, have very different economies, different geographies, different interests. There it is popping up again, folks. So like they did with the Great Compromise, they came with a 3/5 compromise. The Founding Fathers at the Constitutional Convention took a step back and said, all right, 3/5 of slaves will be counted. Not all slaves, not none of slaves, but 3/5 of them will count towards the state populations. And that was a good enough compromise to get everyone to agree. So keep in mind, so basically we have looked at how the United States almost plunged into civil war and how the Founding Fathers basically prevented it. And you guys had a lot of really good possible answers, and similarly to the last workshop, we basically combined a lot of these possible answers into the right one for this workshop. The United States almost plunged into civil war because the Articles of Confederation were ridiculous. They didn't work. They were ineffective. They were horrible. They were stupid. They were dumb. They shouldn't have been passed in the first place. And of course, hindsight's 2020, right? Under that system, the federal government wasn't able to function, and because of that, an army wasn't able to keep the peace, and as a result, they almost plunged into civil war. So in order to stop this, they changed the system of government. They met at the Constitutional Convention. They drafted a new constitution. But in doing so, they needed to compromise. They had a lot of debates. There were a lot of arguments over how this constitution would look like and what it would look like. And they had to compromise on a lot of these issues, like with the Great Compromise and the 3/5, in order to get both sides to agree and to move forward through the process. So that being said, you would think we got our new constitution. Let's implement it, right? No, we have one more compromise to do, and that's going to come in the next workshop. So keep that in mind as you're kind of letting this all sit and digest in your wonderful smart minds there. In terms of the questions at the end, what were the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? We already kind of went over that. The inability to regulate trade or collect taxes made the country poor, and the fact that there wasn't a standing military. We couldn't keep the peace. Two really pivotal things any country really needs to do in order to prevent these things. What were the main debates surrounding the newly proposed Constitution? Number one, how Congress would be set up. Would it be based on equal representation? Would it be based on state populations? Number two, when they got through that whole debacle and decided that it would be basically one of each, in the one divided by state populations, would slaves be counted? And essentially they basically said, let's compromise again. 3/5 will. Have both sides meet in the middle. And that's what happened. Third question, how the Great Compromise reinforced the civic values. Basically extended equality in the fact that, in kind of two ways. Number one, both sides in the argument kind of got a little bit of what they wanted. They were both treated as equals. But more importantly, there's a house in Congress, and it's the more important house, the Senate, that has equality among all the states. Every state gets two representatives, no matter their size, their state population. And that's equality right then and there being put into our new government. So that was exciting to see. How did the 3/5 compromise not reinforce the civic values? You can imagine it basically upheld the institution of slavery, and slavery goes against equality, justice, and liberty all at the same time. So I don't know how the South was really kind of viewing that, but there you have it. The bullet point on the rubric is bullet point 4, just to make sure you guys are, once again, looking at the bullet points under the knowing and thinking and social studies. So there you have it. Nice job. Once again, if you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email, come in after school, and be thinking about that, what that last debate is going to be over the Constitution. We're going to get into that in our 5th workshop coming up. So nice job. Just an update on where you should be at your project. We're about halfway through the project right now. We have about 2 weeks until you guys do your mock trial. And as I've seen, you guys have been all working really, really well in your teams, coming up with evidence, coming up with Supreme Court cases that are either justifying and upholding the civic value of liberty or not upholding the civic value of liberty. So you guys are doing a really great job on that. Some feedback I just would like you guys to keep in mind, some ideas to keep in mind. Be looking at your counter arguments. When I went around yesterday and last week, I saw a lot of good arguments for why these Supreme Court cases supported your argument. But be thinking about counter arguments as well. Those are just as important. In this trial and in real Supreme Court cases, someone will say, Roe v. Wade supports my opinion. And then the Supreme Court or the judge will come out to them and say, well, what about this case? That highlights basically a contradictory statement to what you're saying. So be prepared for those counter arguments and how you can rebuttal with those, because that's what really a good argument is. A good argument always incorporates good counter arguments and thinks about them as you prepare for it. So like I said, any questions on anything, let me know, and take it easy.